Welcome to today's webinar, American Highways Are Being Removed, What's Next?, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning on behalf of the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I am the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will post it on the website soon under the Webinar Archives tab. We will also post relevant information about today's program on that web page. We encourage you to visit the website and subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars and find news and information about smart growth and innovative planning approaches across the U.S. You can also learn about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. In addition, today's webinar is offered in coordination with the Congress for the New Urbanism and their communications manager, Lisa Shamus. For more information about CNU, visit cnu.org. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNU-A CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org. Log into your account and search for the name of today's event, which is American Highways Are Being Removed, What's Next? You can also search for event number 919-4014. So to get us started, our speakers today are Ben Crowther, Eric Frisch, and Ann De Silva Tella. Ben Crowther manages CNU's Highways to Boulevards and Freeways Without Futures initiatives. He first encountered new urbanism while conducting research for his doctoral dissertation on architecture, community, and street design in the Roman Empire. Ben holds a Master of Arts in Humanities from the University of Chicago and a Bachelor of Arts in Classics from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He completed his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. Eric Frisch is Manager of Special Projects for the City of Rochester, New York's Department of Environmental Services in the Bureau of Architecture and Engineering. He oversees the coordination of the Rock the Riverway initiative, a plan to transform Rochester's urban waterfront along the Genesee River. Prior to taking this position in 2018, Eric served as the city's transportation specialist for 11 years, where he managed Rochester's transportation planning, traffic calming, and traffic control functions. Eric has played a key role in several important city initiatives in recent years, including the Inner Loop East Transformation Project, implementation of the Bicycle Master Plan, developing a bike share system, and supporting such projects as Midtown Rising and the downtown two-way traffic conversion. He served as a program manager with the Genesee Transportation Council before joining the city in 2007. Ann De Silva Tella is the Assistant Commissioner of Neighborhood and Business Development in the City of Rochester. During the past 14 years with the city, she has transitioned through several roles in community development, housing development, and project and economic development. Earlier in her career, Ann worked in housing development and management in the UK, where she received a Bachelor's of Science degree in land administration. She has since received a Master's of Urban Planning from SUNY at Buffalo. In planning urban development projects, she is keenly aware of the push and pull between the developer's bottom line and the larger community benefits that must flow from a collaborative project. Following their presentations, our panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question at any time during their presentations by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. So now with all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben. Welcome, Ben.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ben Crowther, the Manager of Transportation Initiatives for the Congress for the New Urbanism, a national nonprofit that champions walkable urbanism. As an introduction to today's webinar, I'd like to provide some context for the Highways to Boulevards movement and address some of the benefits of highway removal. In the 20th century, the American era of highway building created sprawling freeways that cut huge swaths through our cities. Too often, vibrant, diverse, and functioning neighborhoods were destroyed or isolated by their construction, devastating communities and economies alike. Today, many of these urban freeways are reaching the end of their designed lifespan, and their continuing purpose and worth has been called into question. The Highways to Boulevard movement seeks to replace these aging, limited access highways that are out of context with their urban surroundings with city streets and boulevards that include cars, but do not make them a priority. These streets serve a wider variety of users and act as places of commerce and gathering, as well as networks for transportation. Since 2008, we at the Congress for the New Urbanism have tracked this phenomenon in urban planning. So how do we get here? Some might say it was an act of God. In 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake struck the San Francisco Bay Area and damaged several of the major highways there, including I-80 in Oakland, the Central Freeway in San Francisco, and the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco. Two of these highways were eventually removed. That's the Embarcadero Freeway, which you see here, which was transformed into a boulevard, as well as the Central Freeway in San Francisco, also removed. And I-880 was repaired, but it was rerouted outside to the edge of the urban core, so it no longer disrupted the neighborhoods it traversed through. And this is generally taken as the start of the Highways to Boulevards movement, although there are a few examples that come from before this era, most notably the removal of Harbor Drive in Portland, Oregon. So while it may appear on its face to be an act of God, there's an underlying tension involving highway building that feeds into community dissatisfaction with some of the highways in their area. So if we look, for instance, at the city of Baltimore, we see that this 1959 design here, 3 highways are meant to intersect in what's now Baltimore's Inner Harbor. That's I-83, I-70, and I-95. But a substantial amount of community opposition stopped each of these projects. And it's mainly community dissatisfaction with the inflexibility of major roadways that only serve a single purpose, and that's moving cars at a high speed. So the community stopped not 1, but 3 of these different highways, and with the result that this is what the Inner Harbor looks today, and compared to its design vision for 1959. It's an area of public space that can be used for a number of different functions. It's a tourist destination and attraction, hosts the National Aquarium, among other businesses and office spaces. And if we look to the satellite imagery, we can see written in the landscape the story of this opposition to the highway. Here on the screen, we have 3 different examples of where in Baltimore, highways were stopped mid-construction because the community didn't want a major freeway in their backyard because of the negative impacts such as pollution, such as the destruction of local businesses and economies, and the relocation of housings through the seizure with eminent domain. And so in the top left corner, we have I-83, which at downtown Baltimore transitions into President Street and at-grade Boulevard. This was mainly opposed by the communities in Fells Point in Baltimore. On the right of the screen, we have the larger image of I-70, which terminates abruptly at Leakin Park. And then in the bottom left corner of the screen, we have what is now Route 40 through the west side of Baltimore. It was only built out for 18 blocks until it was intended to be I-170, connecting I-70 to I-95 and I-83. But upon the opposition to I-70 and its termination at Leakin Park, this project was abandoned. It's now an 18-block scar across Baltimore's west side and informally known as the Highway to Nowhere. So perhaps it's not unsurprising that these incomplete highway projects, as well as highway spurs and other redundant sections in cities, which add little value to the overall connectivity of the interstate system, are now the segments most frequently targeted for removal, like Baltimore's Highway to Nowhere. These interfaces are redundant in a lot of ways, so that even if these spurs are removed or similar urban highway interfaces are removed, the connectivity of the overall system remains the same and largely unaffected outside of those who are traveling within or into the city as a destination. Now, there are a number of benefits associated with highway removal, which makes it appealing. Through removing a highway and converting the right-of-way into city streets or boulevards, a city can gain a vibrant public realm that offers community members places to relax, shop, and enjoy each other's company. Can gain economic gains through the opportunity to reclaim acres from the former right-of-way for development, which boosts the city's tax bases, provides access to jobs, and increases household wealth along the corridor. And it gains the additional benefit of a healthy environment by dispersing traffic across multiple streets rather than concentrating all the pollutants on a single road. And the hallmark of all of these projects is that the street serves a wider variety of users than a highway, which caters solely to automobile drivers. So since 2000, the pace of highways to boulevards projects has accelerated in the United States. To date, American cities have either replaced or committed to replace a freeway with more urban streets 17 times. And you'll note here on the list of these projects that nearly half of those have happened just within the previous decade. So this is something that is accelerating quickly and becoming a more and more mainstream phenomenon in planning. For those projects that have been completed, the results have been revealing, especially in smaller cities that aren't of the magnitude of, say, San Francisco or New York City, which has also completed highways to boulevards projects. For instance, in 2002, the city of Milwaukee removed the Park East Freeway. This was, as I mentioned before, is a spur that one of the types of highways that are easily removed without affecting larger interstate connectivity. It was replaced with McKinley Avenue and a reconnected street grid. And you can see that there were substantial benefits gained through the project. While it cost $45 million in total, the amounts for development were several times that. The project removed 28 acres for development, and which were turned over to developments like this one. You can see here, this is the Flatiron building in Milwaukee, which is the former terminus, occupies the former terminus of the Park East Freeway. Another example is the 2004 conversion of the Riverfront Parkway in Chattanooga. In this case, it's a 1.6 mile at-grade highway that was replaced with a 2-lane boulevard and an expanded Riverfront Park. And that's one of the things that we've seen more and more in this highways to boulevards movement. Riverfront highways are also very targeted because that land is unique and appealing to the city to open up to public use. So green spaces are a particularly good option for highways to boulevards conversion. And so in this case, the city of Chattanooga undertook this as part of their 21st century waterfront plan, which was a larger transformation of 120 acres of the downtown riverfront. And this is what it looks like today with that 2-lane boulevard, very accessible to pedestrians who can enjoy the waterfront, access the park, and even used the street for not impromptu, but rather for planned gatherings like markets in this case. What we've seen lately, though, is that New York State, and especially upstate New York, is on the forefront of the next generation of highway removal, with several projects proposed and/or actually underway as we speak. And so today we'll take a closer look at one of them, the Inner Loop East project in Rochester, which filled the depressed Inner Loop in 2017 and reclaimed 9 acres of developable land. In the 3 years since the project start, the city has attracted $229 million in investment and over 10-fold return on the $21 million they spent to fill in the Inner Loop. So with that introduction in mind, I'll now turn it over to Ann and Eric to tell you how they've achieved the success that they've had with the Inner Loop East project.
Thank you very much, Ben. Appreciate the kind introduction. My name is Eric Frisch. As I said, I'm manager of special projects here at the City of Rochester in our Bureau of Architecture and Engineering, although I'll note that I am a transportation planner by trade. I'm going to be speaking about the transportation side of the Inner Loop East project, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Ann DeSilva, who will speak about the land use and development side of our project. I just want to take a moment to thank Smart Growth Network and its many partners, most notably the Congress for the New Urbanism, for this opportunity to tell Rochester's story on such a big stage. Appreciate all of you for tuning in to listen. We're extremely proud of our highway removal success story here in Rochester, and we hope that the work that we've done here is helping to pave the way for similar projects all across North America. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, Rochester is situated in western New York State in the Finger Lakes region on the southern shore of Lake Ontario, about an hour or so from the Canadian border. But our downtown is located actually where the Erie Canal once crossed the Genesee River, near the majestic high falls of the Genesee, which powered our early industries. And our culinary contribution to the world, whether we like it or not, is the garbage plate, and you're welcome. The Inner Loop Expressway historically encircled downtown Rochester in a tight noose-like form. The section of expressway that we removed, the Inner Loop East, is highlighted here in purple, about a 2/3 mile segment. As a brief history, although the metropolitan area's population has continued to grow over time, the city of Rochester's population peaked in the mid-1950s at just over 330,000 people. In the early 20th century, with the automobile population exploding, our city was clogged with congestion, and city leaders were looking to solve this problem. Ultimately, they chose to double down on car-oriented solutions such as expressways. The idea was that the Inner Loop Expressway would better distribute the traffic through and around the downtown area. The Inner Loop would ultimately connect to I-490, which it does today, but it was also intended to complete the extension of I-390 into the downtown area, which never occurred, and a northern expressway, which was only on the drawing boards and never moved ahead. To build the Inner Loop East, approximately 150 parcels were demolished to make way for the expressway. The idea for the Inner Loop was hatched as early as the 1920s, as shown here in the Bartholomew Plan, demonstrating a ring road around the central business district with arterials emanating in each direction. It eventually made its way into official arterial state highway plans, as shown on the right, where the name Inner Loop was coined. Here are some detailed looks at early designs for what eventually did become the Inner Loop. And if you look closely, you'll see that there's a difference between state and city proposals for what was to become of the Inner Loop. Ultimately, what did become the Inner Loop turned out to be a bit different than what's shown there. And in this image, you can see, although crudely drawn by yours truly, the path of the expressway going through neighborhoods prior to its construction, demonstrating rich urban fabric that existed in this area when the expressway was built. Or maybe it'd be better seen from above. This image from 1930 showing a car, or showing a city that largely densely built, almost a medieval street pattern. Fast forward 3 decades and you see the inner loop being built, as well as a number of other urban renewal projects, clearing what was perceived by many to be blight and making way for a car-oriented future. And as an aside, if you look up Rochester City of Quality on YouTube, you'll see a hilarious but real depiction of what our city leaders were thinking at the time for what was, as they said, a city of progress. Fast forward another 5 decades, and this is what our downtown looked like 2014 before construction of the Inner Loop East project moved ahead. As you see, the Inner Loop is built in that noose-like pattern around the downtown core, which in one way defined downtown Rochester very easily, but in another way stifled its growth and its connection to adjacent neighborhoods. And as this image demonstrates, if the goal was indeed to eliminate congestion, then clearly they had more success than they ever could have imagined, as this is rush hour prior to construction. So the Inner Loop Expressway, of course, was a state-owned facility, reference route 940T, principal arterial expressway. This was state-owned and under state jurisdiction, consisting of 4 to 6 expressway lanes with parallel 2 to 3 lane frontage streets. The frontage streets were the jurisdiction of the city, and the expressway was jurisdiction of the state. Entrance and exit ramps, all the kit and caboodle of what you would expect on a highway corridor. As much as 12 lanes in total, and 355 feet wide at its widest part. But because some of these expressways were never built, this section of the Inner Loop Expressway, at least, never carried the traffic that it was built to handle. As you see there, somewhere between 7,000 and 11,000 cars a day in this section of the Inner Loop Expressway. When combined with the adjacent frontage streets, you're talking about, traffic volumes that are reasonably posted on a standard 2-lane city arterial street. Obviously, there would not be major traffic impacts by removing this facility and distributing that traffic to the existing street grid. There was more going on. The Inner Loop facility was aging and deteriorating. It was unsightly in many locations. There were structural issues. There were substandard design features, safety concerns. You can see the gentleman running across the expressway there where it came up to grade, because it was easier to do that than to try and make your way around to one of the few crossings of this facility, which separated densely populated, vibrant city neighborhoods from the downtown core. And of course, as with any type of facility like this, it depressed property values and discouraged active land uses along its frontage. Removal or replacement of this section of the Inner Loop Expressway has been featured in every planning document produced by or on behalf of the city since 1990's Vision 2000 plan. So you could say it took us only 25 years to get from vision to reality. Not so bad. A federally funded planning study conducted through our metropolitan planning organization, the Genesee Transportation Council, was completed in 2001, and the formal scoping phase for the Inner Loop East project kicked off in 2009. Although before we had even kicked off the scoping phase, our late great Congressperson Louise Slaughter had already secured all the funding needed to conduct the engineering and design for the eventual project. The reasons for doing this project, of course, are obvious, I'm sure, to all 700 or so of you listening. We want to reconnect our neighborhoods and correct historic wrongs. We want to create new, clean, mixed-use infill redevelopment sites, basically creating a whole new neighborhood that connects downtown with adjacent East End, Park Avenue, Neighborhood of the Arts, Monroe Village, and everything to the east. Want to enhance the bicycle pedestrian environment and connectivity therein. Obviously, when there are only a handful of connection points across this expressway, that discourages bicycle and pedestrian activity. So although you have densely built development on either side, that exchange between the two was limited. We want to promote livability. Our downtown is booming with residential growth. We wanted to continue to see that and have that bleed back and forth between the neighborhoods. And of course, not to mention the long-term maintenance costs and operations costs of having a grade separated highway versus a city arterial street, and save considerable funds when doing so. As I mentioned, negative impact of the inner loop. Again, these are pictures that show the facility as it was, the neighborhood being separated, safety concerns, non-standard features, depressed property values, etc. Even so, this project was not viewed as a transportation project by state officials at the time, but more as a community development project. State transportation officials at the time felt that there was no real transportation benefit to the project. So we couldn't obtain funding from regional formula transportation funds to do this work. We had to find non-traditional sources. Thankfully, we timed this pretty well because the Tiger program came into existence at this same time. We tried first during the first round of Tiger, and we were admittedly premature. We tried again, I think 2 years later. Much better attempt. We were still unsuccessful, but we met with USDOT down in DC to discuss our project, received great feedback, which led to us fine-tuning our project and most importantly, producing an airtight benefit cost analysis. And ultimately, in 2013, we were awarded Tiger grant that paid for the lion's share of this project cost. I remember the day because it was my birthday and it was the best birthday present I could receive. The downside, of course, is that we had to then turn this project around very quickly. If you recall, when Tiger, they had very quick turnaround times to go from design to completion, get this funding out on the street and get people to work. So we turned this project from preliminary engineering to construction documents in less than 1 year, working with the design team at Stantec, who are our design consultants for this project. We worked hard and we got it done. And this project, the design progressed dramatically during that public involvement phase as we went from preliminary to final. The early concept largely, as shown here, largely took the form of the inner loop that was to precede it with its curvy shape, and we had 2 roundabouts that were part of that. But in the public involvement process, ultimately, we eliminated those roundabouts and we took a more traditional urban street grid approach, which created as well more walkable streets and more developable land. We even changed adjacent street entrances to residential streets to driveway style to discourage cut-through traffic. That's a result of that public input period. The recommended final design, the cross-section, as shown here, was generally 3 lanes with on-street parking, a 2-way protected bike facility, wide tree lawns, and wider sidewalks. The narrowed right-of-way from replacing this highway with this city street created over 6 acres of land for redevelopment. Here are some views of construction occurring at the time. It's downtown Rochester right in front of you there, and you can see to the lower left the Inner Loop East corridor under construction. Roughly 120,000 cubic yards of fill was brought in to do this work. Here's another picture during construction. As you see all that earth being brought in, the biggest construction impact during this project was actually the removal of the 3 bridges at East Avenue, Broad Street, and Monroe Avenue, which required traffic detours. But although a project of this size you would think would have considerable construction impacts, in fact, the return of 2-way traffic to the historic Union Street corridor proved good for businesses on that corridor, and they actually blossomed during the construction period as they had a front door to the construction. Here's another picture showing all that earth being moved. So again, returning to the picture from 2014 prior to construction, fast forward to 2018 at the end of construction, and you can see Union Street restored, the expressway removed to the bottom right there, and land being created. Here's a close-up view. I believe this is spring 2019. And you can start to see developments taking place on some of that land. And here's another image. That picture to your left, that building is now complete. You'll learn more about all these developments shortly from my colleague Ann. Bicycle pedestrian traffic has risen dramatically since the highway was removed. And again, this project is now complete as shown. Well, the most recent bicycle and pedestrian count in the corridor showed a 50% increase in pedestrian activity and a 67% increase in bike traffic within the corridor. I want to credit, and maybe he's even listening, but Jacob Mason, whoever you are, on Twitter for this interesting juxtaposition of old and new. I'll do that one more time. So this is the expressway and what existed at one point, and this is it now, showing construction underway, the two-way bike facility, the reduced width street. These are some of the pictures of developments that Ann will be talking about shortly. But of course, we're not done. There's a lot more inner loop left to go. And so we are now turning our attention to what we're calling Inner Loop North. We're ready to see what we can do. Goals for Inner Loop North, similar to the Inner Loop East, to look into the potential for highway removal or reconstruction, better link our historic public market with the downtown area, reconnect University Avenue, which is severed currently by the Inner Loop, potentially narrow East Main Street, bring in considerable additional mixed-use infill development and open space possibilities in this park-poor neighborhood. We secured $1 million to conduct a planning study through New York State that'll examine the feasibility, look into preferred alternatives, and do a full-blown benefit cost analysis on that preferred alternative. It's considered by regional economic development officials a economic development priority, and it'll connect with our Rock the Riverway Riverfront Investment Initiative, where the Inner Loop crosses the Genesee River and provides and presents a barrier to north-south bicycle and pedestrian traffic along the river. It can have greater benefit to the community, but it definitely will pose more interesting challenges. It's got considerably more traffic volumes, and it's a much larger facility on the north side. But where there's greater challenges, there's greater rewards. Here are some potential, very preliminary, high-level concepts for what could be, just to get your creative juices flowing. Cities across New York State, as was mentioned before, like Buffalo, Syracuse, New York City, are in the midst of their own efforts toward highway removal. New York State is a partner in these efforts, as they are here, and we're looking forward to more success stories from New York State and beyond. So that is the transportation section of this presentation. I'm going to turn it over now to Ann DeSilva-Tella, Assistant Commissioner of Neighborhood and Business Development, to discuss the development and land use side.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon to you. Again, my name is Ann DeSilva-Tella. I'm with the city's Neighborhood and Business Development Department, and I will be speaking to you today about the land use and development side of this Inner Loop East project. I will follow this general list of topics in order, taking you through the timeline, talking a little bit about our public meetings, acquisition from New York State DOT, the RFP process, the projects that we subsequently selected and their current status, as well as the overall impact, which we call Inner Loop East by the numbers. And so this project comes over to the development side largely around 2014, when the street transformation project is well underway, but now we're turning our minds to what would happen after the development would be completed in December 2017. So in 2014, we undertook a series of land use and design studies that involved lots of community input, stakeholder meetings, and focus groups. And we came up with some really nice design ideas and land use possibilities. And that nothing really happened after that till about 2016, when we're really thinking about RFPing these parcels now for development. And so we go back to the community for public meetings, specifically asking what folks wanted to see in these 7 development parcels that had resulted. So just to orient you, we have 6 acres at this time spread over 7 development parcels of varying sizes. In 2016 was when we finally did put out, second quarter, we put out our first RFP, and that included 5 of the 7 sites. We selected 3 projects to happen over 4 of the sites. Now, this might look a little backwards to you, but after putting out an RFP for land, we actually proceed to acquire the land. So at the time we RFP'd this, we unfortunately were not the owners of the land at the time. Most of it still belonged to New York State Department of Transportation. And this is noteworthy because it is a little bit of an involved process acquiring this land back from the state, and I will be talking about that a little bit later. And so in the first quarter of 2018, we finally issue the first building permit for one of the sites. And 18 months later, in quarter 3 of 2019, we have our first certificate of occupancy and lease up starts on that very first project. Fast forward to today, early 2020, land sales continue, constructions continue. We've closed on the sale of 4 of the 7 sites. We've selected developments for all 7 sites, by the way. As I said, 1 project is completed, 2 are underway, and all the others are in various stages of being close to closing, seeking site plan permits and all of that. And so let's go back to the public meetings that were happening in early 2016. We had 3 public meetings, 2 of them in the evening and 1 of them at noon on a work day, trying to make sure we could capture the people who worked here, including those who weren't available to come out to evening meetings, but just giving people a choice of when they could come out to talk to us. And what we were largely presenting was the makeup of the sites, the sizes, where they were located, and a lot of the information that we gathered during our land use and design studies, because that's really all we had at this time to present to people to react to. We got a lot of comments, as you might well imagine, and at the bottom left of my screen, you will see what is 1 page of a 6-page Excel chart, where I essentially captured every single comment that was either said to somebody at the meeting or written on a Post-it note and stuck on a board with various degrees of vehemence, support, no support, and all of that. After putting all of that together, I came up with 3 of the most expressed opinions, which included the demand for more green space, a very, very loud, clear asking for more parking, and to a smaller extent, but coming in third, was people saying do not give the developers any tax abatements as an incentive for development. So as I said earlier, we'll just talk a little bit about acquisition of the land, because obviously you're not going to get to development if you do not control the land. And typically it's owned by the DOT, but that might vary depending on where you are. Not all of it was owned by the DOT, and so begins a very intense period of searching the archives, mapping, coming up with who owns what, survey maps and all of that. I would advise a lot of research at this point, because in the researching, somebody comes up with a document that tells us that at the time the inner loop was being designed back in the 50s, an agreement had been made with the state DOT that we would sell the land for 50% of its value at the time. Not quite sure why, but that meant today we would buy the land back from them at 50% of its value, because they paid only 50% of its value at the time. So obviously this little bit of information worked very well in the city's favor, and we were very glad to have found this information. Obviously, part of acquiring the land, if you're the municipality, would be to start early, I would advise, and talk often with the state. Their processes can be very protracted. There can be very many sub-agencies that need to speak into the process. Don't forget to identify your acquisition costs through whatever legislative process that you have in place. and make sure you get your council's authorization to acquire the land. And all of this must be done in a very timely fashion. So now let's fast forward to the RFPs. Actually, we're not fast forwarding, because if you look back at the timeline, you will see that we actually put out RFPs before we had acquired the land. Well, we had to really act on faith, I guess, that we would be able to acquire the land so we could really kickstart this development process. So in putting out the RFPs, you're basically faced with 7 sites and thinking about what order do you release these sites in. Do you put them all 7 out at once? Do you want to start at one end and work your way down the middle? Is something happening somewhere along that stretch that you want to capitalize on, and so you would go with those sites first? All of that will obviously come into play as you decide on your order, and obviously this could depend on existing plans. Now, when you decide on the order, you're drafting your RFP, and this is where the municipality, for a change, depending on what kind of market you have, obviously. Now, in our downtown area, we were not particularly enjoying a robust economic time. So we had many vacant commercial buildings that were not really up to date. We were basically in a period where we desperately wanted development to happen downtown. But this is a place where you can actually start to consider what kind of community benefits that you would be seeking in exchange for this opportunity for people to build on new land, as it were, because no one's really able to create new land except through this kind of process. And you're creating new land in the downtown area, and the expectation was that folks would really want to participate in this. So what could we ask for in return? So this is where we articulated where we wanted a certain percentage of any market rate development to include affordable housing. Now, what we were really thinking about is that there would be market rate projects and there would be affordable projects. And so we wanted to make sure that in any affordable project, we would push the developers to include higher AMI units as well. So don't cluster 30, 40, 50, 60% AMI housing in one place. See if in that project you can range from 30% to hopefully 90%, and in some cases 130% of the area median income. And on the other hand, when we're talking to our market rate developers, we are also insisting that 20% of the units in their market rate project must include housing for up to 60% AMI households, so that when everything was said and done, we would have every single development having a really nice income mix. So this was the opportunity for us to basically push for this in exchange for choosing your project through the RFP process. Another community benefit we were looking for would be MWBE, Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprise Goals, so that in every resulting development, we would insist that 30% of the contracts for the contractors and subcontractors would go to these minority and women-owned enterprises. We also had workforce goals. So apart from the enterprises, we wanted to make sure that the actual boots on the ground included city residents and also women and also minorities. So we had separate goals for each of those 3 categories, and we would expect these developers to report on these goals on a monthly basis to us. As far as development goals, these also had to be clearly articulated in the RFP. In our case, we got a lot of those from our design and land use studies that I talked about. Those happened back in 2014. Combine those with the input from the public meetings in early 2016. And in summary, we were looking for active ground floor uses, which meant that there would be no surface parking lots fronting onto South Union Street, which is the name of the resulting street after the inner loop. So this was a very hard and fast rule, and we had to really articulate this clearly in the RFPs. We were looking for more density, of course. We wanted more creative design because our developers seem to have fallen into a lull basically, and we're just, you know, producing the same looking kind of developments. And this was a chance to renew things a little bit. And folks were looking for a high wow factor. And so having said all of that, this is, I'll talk now about some of the selected projects that are actually either have been completed or are underway. So you'll see site 1, which is, if you do see the beginning map of the whole inner loop on the front page, it would be the smallest site starting on the right side of the screen. And for this project, we have 50 units of mostly affordable housing, but we worked very hard with the developer to make sure we had developments that did not look like affordable housing in any way, shape, or form. And also, even in an affordable housing project where really there's not a lot of room or maneuver space for frills, we had to make sure that they were making the ground floor look active, even if they weren't able to have commercial uses on the ground floor. And so you would have your community space, maybe service provider offices on the ground floor, but whatever it takes to try to keep it more open and make it more lively. For site 2, which is the next site to the left, we're going to end up with 114 units. Again, it is largely affordable housing, 30% to 60% AMI. But we will also have a daycare center attached to one end of this building, which is a very exciting area of need in the downtown area. Inner Loop Site 3 will be 72 units. It will have a space for either a retail store or a restaurant. And we will definitely be having a pharmacy. And again, we're very excited because this is another thing that would be a really big win for the downtown area. As far as the status of this project, we have closed on the sale of the land. I believe that they have received funding from the State Housing Agency and that construction will commence by the summer of this year. So that's sites 1, 2, and 3. Moving on to site 4 and 5. These are lumped together because the winning bid for this RFP was a consortium, if you like, of 3 different entities. One of them is a developer of housing and mixed-use projects. The other one is a commercial developer who does hotels and mainly restaurants. And the third partner was the existing National Museum of Play, the Strong Museum of Play, which is located down at this end to the west of Inner Loop Site 5. If you look at the top left image with the purple sites, you will see a sea of parking right above Inner Loop Site 5. Today, that is largely a 4-story parking garage, mostly still under construction, right, Eric? Yep. But probably close to completion. So for across Inner Loop Site 4 and 5, we're going to have the museum expand its footprint by 100,000 square feet. We were going to have this 4-story parking garage, 236 units of mostly market rate housing down here, a 120 all-suites hotel directly adjacent to the Museum of Play, because the Museum of Play is undertaking this expansion and this parking project because it had done its own studies, and these were the things it needed to do in order to expand its visitor reach to beyond a 4-hour drive radius. And so this museum will be attracting visitors from Toronto, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and beyond. And this 120 all-suites hotel will largely cater to families with young children so that they would actually stay at least one night in Rochester. The bottom left image, when you're able to zoom in, kind of shows you this whole area which is actually called the Neighborhood of Play. So this is the largest project. And actually, I neglected to mention that there's also a new street being developed as part of this project, which will really help to integrate the neighborhoods that were fractured by the former inner loop. So the status of this project, as I may have hinted across this last few minutes, is that the parking garage is well underway and probably close to completion. 46 of the market rate units are actually completed and are being leased up right now. And construction really continues at a very, very encouraging pace. So the remaining two sites are sites 6 and 7. As you can tell, 6 is really the smallest of the sites. And this developer has creatively planned to develop 5 townhouses on this site. And site 7 will actually end up being 56 units of mostly affordable housing. It will go up to 90% AMI. So we're calling that kind of workforce and mixed income housing. There will be 6,000 square feet on the ground floor of largely theater, practice, and community space. We have a local theater called the Jiva Theater that will lease space in this area and hold community practice and rehearsals over here, which will definitely add to our active ground floor space that we were seeking. The funding application for this project was submitted in December, and closing will not occur until the project has been funded. As for the 5 townhomes, we're about to plan the closing on the land. So in summary, when all said and done, this would have been a very, very nice project where we were looking at a $22 million public investment on the transportation side that would have created 6 acres of development-ready sites on 7 parcels, and it would have resulted in $229 million in private investment. This is a real coup as far as cities go, for sure. We will have over 150,000 square feet of commercial space, over 500 housing units, 170 permanent jobs, and over 2,000 construction jobs. And best of all, we would have reconnected the neighborhoods that were previously fractured by this 8-lane highway. We will have a much safer walking and biking environment for our residents, definitely more livable community with jobs and growth in the city's tax base. And so this is really exciting for us, and that ends my presentation on the development side of this project.
Great, thank you very much, Anne and Eric and Ben. So throughout the presentation so far, we've been getting a number of questions from the audience, and we're now going to move into the Q&A session. You can continue to submit questions as we move into the discussion, and we'll answer as many as we can till about 2:30 Eastern time. And I will say we have gotten a number already, so thank you everybody who has submitted so far. So I think we'll maybe start with some of, and meanwhile our panelists are putting on their webcam so you can see them while we are having the conversation. So given that we are looking at one case study, I'll start with some questions specific to Rochester, and then we'll go back to some of the broader ones that came in earlier for Ben. So the first one to start, in addition to the 7 development sites, do you have new or redevelopment on the opposite side of the road as a result of the road removal?
Well, we are seeing investments in existing buildings that were along the corridor. So there's a brew pub in a building that faces it that was in business during the construction. They are now expanding to take over the entire building, and the architecture firm that shared that building with them bought a building further down Union Street in the same corridor and is now upgrading that as a good example. Also, immediately adjacent, and maybe Ann might be able to speak a bit to this, the Charlotte Square, the overall Charlotte Square redevelopment project on Charlotte Street, which probably would not have occurred without this investment.
Right, and that particular project has another 72 units of market rate housing and actually 10 really high priced for sale townhomes. So I guess that's not something we're seeing a lot of downtown, so we're encouraged by the home ownership that's also starting to take place.
Okay. Next question is, how do you encourage the services in demand, i.e. pharmacies, to become a tenant within the proposed development?
That's a good question. So it's largely been a result of our developers partnering with other folks who want to do this. So we understand that a lot of the funding for this kind of thing, like the pharmacy, for example, they have a partnership with a local entity that actually services people living with AIDS, like HOPWA. So they know how to tap into the funding that's available through HUD and through some other agencies who are providing support services and development funding for for specific types of specific communities. So that's what happened in that case, and that was a very, very clever move on the part of that developer, and obviously made us select this that particular project for that site because it scored very highly in the RFP process. That's essentially where we're seeing most of the funding coming from, is when developers are able to partner with service providers who then bring along funding sources from all of the different agencies that provide those kinds of services.
Okay, we've gotten several questions about the RFP process, so I'll ask a few here. How were developer RFPs evaluated and the developers selected?
So what we do typically at the city, in the RFP, we do include specific selection criteria. And a lot of that includes a little bit of what I talked about, like obviously the land use and the design standards that we're looking for, some of the community benefits. And we do make it clear that these are the elements that the RFPs will be scored on. And so internally, we would create a team of very varied backgrounds. And we had folks from landscape architecture, the assessor's office, real estate development folks, just to make sure we had somewhat of a well-rounded team looking at all of these. And everybody brings a different lens to the way they look at this, but we have a very strict scoring sheet that comes right out of the criteria that were included in the RFP. So developers are really clear on what it is we're looking for, and it's up to them to speak to those specific things or not in their responses, but that's really what we're scoring folks on. Now, it's not always clear when you're done scoring who's the best, development to select. And so in this case, we actually had to do quite a few interviews. So if we received four proposals for one site, we may decide to interview 2 or 3 of the highest scoring developers because there were just different aspects of it that folks weren't sure of. And you also want to gauge what their level of commitment is to what was said in the RFP. And to be honest with you, oftentimes developers do double back and change their minds about things that were in the RFP. And I would advise municipalities to hold strong to what it is that you really want, and hope you have the political support to pull back a selected proposal if the developer changes something too much from what was selected, because it is a competitive process. And if a substantial change is made, then technically you really should go back and review the second and third highest scores to see if maybe those 2 are actually more in line with what you're looking for now.
Okay, another question on the RFPs. For the RFPs, did you establish design standards or specify the desired uses? And did you make any changes to the zoning or regulations for more adjacent private or for the adjacent private land?
So the zoning for most of our downtown is the same. It's the Center City District, and it is actually a very forgivable zoning, and it has not too many rules to it.
It's a form-based code.
So what was the first part of the question? I forget. Can you repeat the first part of your question, please?
Oh, sorry, we're looking at the next one. Oops. Let me hold on for a second. Did you make any changes to zoning or regulations for the adjacent private land?
No, all of the zoning stayed the same, so we didn't make any changes. Probably the second part that I missed.
Right, and again, it's a form-based code, so it largely is not driven by the use. It's driven by the shape that that the developments take, and that was spelled out in the RFP process.
Oh, and our design standards, yes, we actually attached the documents that came out of the 2014 studies that were undertaken. We attached every single one of the comments that we received from the community during the meetings as well, and really urged all of the proposal responders to read all of those documents and actually speak to them, as well as our Center City master plan.
Okay, thank you. So we had a couple questions asking about why traffic signals were used instead of roundabouts.
Sure. The primary reason was the roundabouts weren't needed from a traffic standpoint. They weren't really providing a significant benefit. And roundabouts, they aren't necessarily as bicycle and pedestrian friendly as a standard signalized intersection. And so, that was really the primary generator, right? Is roundabouts traffic is always flowing, right? And so then you're relying on the goodness of the motorist to behave properly, yield appropriately. Whereas, if we set it up with a signalized system with very clear rules about who has rights of way, everything functions better, and everybody is used to that. So we wanted to have that more traditional urban downtown feel, and that's why we ended up with that. It also helps to square up the development parcels, which was another aspect of it. The roundabouts tend to take up a lot of room and can then not only feed into the development parcels, but also change the shape, which then makes them less developable.
Okay. So with the mix of many modes of travel and lots of at-grade conflicts, what is the desirable posted speed for motor vehicles?
So our city speed limit is 30 miles an hour, and that's the posted speed. It's largely the corridor goes from 2 to 3 to 4 lanes wide, depending on the section, and we are doing bicycle, pedestrian, vehicular counts in the area to track that. As the developments take hold and continue to open up, we're expecting to see growth in all modes of traffic, and we'll continue to pay attention to that. But the city speed limit is 30 miles an hour, and that's how this is designed for.
Okay. So someone made the comment, it's great to see these kinds of projects that reconnect communities, but I was curious why the design still includes 12-foot wide travel lanes.
Well, that's one of those design characteristics that was hotly debated during the process, and we went back and forth, trying to come up with the right balance of design that keeps the intersections tight while still facilitating turning movements for buses and heavy vehicles. So weighing the trade-offs and working with the approval agencies that were involved, let's say, we chose to strike that balance and provide the 12-foot lanes. Now, it also provides an opportunity as we look at this facility in the future, and as we look at Interloop North, saying what did we do right, what did we do wrong, and are there ways that we can change things over time? So we'll certainly be looking at how it functions and make tweaks along the way.
Okay. Question here. I assume the Interloop's very low traffic use is usage is related to the poor local economy of the city. Having removed a section of the inner loop to reconnect neighborhoods, hopefully leading to economic recovery, was future traffic forecasts made, and how would usage of local surface streets be impacted?
Sure. Well, there's a few things. So the low traffic volumes are generally the result of it being built to host traffic that never actually materialized because the connecting expressways weren't built, right? So although it connects to Interstate 490, this particular section didn't have even a direct connection from Interstate 490 to it. The 390 extension into downtown was never built, which would have connected directly to it. And the Northern Expressway, which was just a line on paper, basically, never happened either. So the traffic volumes in this section are largely lower due to that function rather than the economy. But yes, we did have to project out traffic volumes. We did a market study as part of our benefit cost analysis, which determined or made a forecast about how much growth development could be expected in this corridor. And largely what we've experienced with the developments that you heard about do fit within that almost perfectly. And so the traffic volumes are then forecast out based on that growth, as well as other anticipated growth. There's a number of other redevelopment projects happening in the immediate vicinity, as well as background growth over time. And that's in some ways how we ended up with the facility that we have today to host that traffic volume into the future.
Okay. So here's a comment that we'll just add to that. Not a question, but want to thank the both of you for this project. It makes a big difference for the area, from a Rochester resident and fellow planner, John Caterino, in case you know John.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Okay, so here's a question for Ben. Can you speak to the value that incorporating open space and walkability into the newly created space is?
Yeah, I think what's one of the goals, and this largely depends on what the community is looking for incorporating green space, can be to provide an area where there formerly was a community space that was removed by the highway. And so we have some folks we're working with down in New Orleans, and this is along the Claiborne Expressway. Claiborne Avenue was formerly a beautiful tree-lined median, very wide, very accessible, essentially the front porch for all of the community around it. And so in the folks we're working with in New Orleans, they're looking to restore that green space that was taken away with the construction of the expressway. And this really provides a focal point for the community, as well as helps some of the businesses that still exist along Claiborne Avenue recapture some of the clients that they had lost. These are longstanding businesses that have been there in some cases prior to the expressway's construction, and they see this as an attractor to the area. So there's a lot of different economic stimuli that come into play too. This is part of Chattanooga's waterfront redevelopment plan. Really, it was closely linked to the aquarium that's right on the waterfront too. So there's an opportunity to tie a lot of these different projects, whether it's green space or commercial space, together so that they work coherently rather than in opposition or anything like that.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Another question for you that we received earlier, but maybe all three of you could respond to it. How do you avoid gentrification with economic opportunities opened up by removing a highway?
I'll just go first. I think that's really part of what I addressed in the RFP, and making sure that you really do ask for what you want. But obviously that can only come about if you've done enough research and studying of what's around there, and then use that to focus what you want. And in this case, we know we wanted, I mean, what we're finding, you're right that the economy is a little depressed in the city. Most of the funding is in affordable housing because that's just a formulaic kind of thing that happens from the state. And so, you know, it may have been, perhaps we weren't in danger of gentrification with this particular project, but we had found that a lot of downtown commercial buildings were being renovated by private developers. So we needed to create that balance with this project by making sure we had enough affordable housing to just balance everything out when all was said and done.
Okay, did you want to add anything to that, Ben?
Yeah, I'll just really echo what Ann said. This is something that I think city municipal governments have a lot of levers over control of this. And so even in terms of planning for a highway removal project, I think this should be one of the first questions that's asked and should be incorporated in early into the planning process of how do we combat the effects of gentrification. And so really working closely, I know that there's the potential for any campaign advocates out there who are tuning in, working closely with the city from the start and getting their buy-in into committing to that for things like RFPs. Down the road, I think, yeah, you'll get the vision that you've received from the community input. They will be more fulfilling.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one. Related to Ann's discussion of requiring a mix of affordable or market rate housing units, does the city of Rochester or the state of New York have regulations regarding inclusionary zoning?
We did not have inclusionary zoning here in Rochester.
Okay. How was the income mix calculated to ensure the project would be attractive to developers?
Well, so let's not forget that to a certain extent, yes, the city owns the land and yes, we're selling it and we get to choose what we want. But by the time we're doing that, we're actually reacting to developers who have first decided that they want to do this, right? So there's really only so much power that we have in this situation. You basically put out an RFP and sit back to see, with your fingers crossed, what comes in the door. And is it a good enough mix? So the biggest game in town, if you like, is affordable housing. I must admit, we have a very, very good, knowledgeable group of affordable housing developers who just totally understand how the state funding mechanism works. And they've made themselves experts, they've positioned themselves, and Rochester really is a very good recipient of many of those affordable housing dollars. So that's the group of developers who really know what they're doing, and most of the responses did come to us from the affordable housing area of things. And we did have a handful of market rate developers, but it's really largely a decision of the developer whether to submit to us a proposal. And at the time they submit to us, we can kind of leverage the fact that we own the land to say, in exchange for selling you this land, will you commit to 20% of the units being affordable, say, if it was a market rate project. And that was a really big part of it, discussing with developers and negotiating and getting this down in writing that for this for this market rate project, I talked about the 236 unit project on Inner Loop 4 and 5. And that was a factor in that particular project, trying to encourage the developer in exchange, of course, now they're buying the land, but they are paying appraised value. So it's not like we're doing them a favor in that regard, but they ultimately do need tax abatement schedules. So they have to come back to the city for those. And that's another leverage point for us, where in exchange for tax abatement, we would require 20% of the units to go to 60% and below AMI households. And that's how that works.
Okay. What was the proportion of public to private investment in the housing element of the project?
I don't have those numbers, but I'll tell you that in most of the affordable housing projects, I would imagine the majority of the costs, I would say 80 to 90% is public funding. It's the largest funder of affordable housing is the New York State Department of Homes and Community Renewal, DHCR. So that's who funds most of these affordable housing projects. And then you have other agencies that will fund housing for the developmentally disabled or housing for the formerly incarcerated. To a lesser degree, larger affordable housing developers will seek those agencies who then apply for that funding, and they would partner to do a project. And so in a 50-unit project, 8 to 12 of those units could be set aside for those who are coming out of an incarceration situation. But it's in a very deliberate program where they've already selected them from inside prison and started to work with them on how to incorporate themselves back into society and then have them actually live in a new housing situation where there are other people involved, but also service providers available for them.
Okay, thanks, Ann. Next question, probably for Eric. Developer illustrations show lots of landscaping, so the illustration looks pretty. Does the city ordinance approval require the landscaping actually be installed and maintained? And who maintains landscaping on the city right of way?
Well, yeah, I think that's exactly the point, is there's a difference between the landscaping that we have in the public right of way and the landscaping that's shown for the private developments. And so certainly when it comes to the public right of way, largely it's the city's responsibility to do that. However, especially with this particular project, there's at least one location where we have a relatively high-end treatment, sort of a gateway treatment, and we partnered with the Strong Museum of Play to provide that added level of maintenance, and it has like a play theme to it, and welcoming people into the neighborhood as they come off of the adjacent expressway. So that's an example of working with adjacent property owners to do that. And there's examples of local improvement ordinances or other type of districts, special assessment districts that are set up to provide either the neighborhood group or a major property owner or the city themselves that then provides that enhanced level of treatment. As for the private side, I think we work through the site plan review process to work with them on how the landscaping functions, what it means to the relationship to the public right of way, and hold them accountable for that.
Yeah, they are required to submit a landscaping plan that's also approved through site plan. And definitely we do work to hold them to what they designed and what was approved.
Okay. Another question. The loop looks like it would be a perfect streetcar ring. Where is the transit?
Well, we don't have rail-based transit in Rochester. It's something that we'll continue to keep an eye on as we move forward and continue to bring back our downtown area. We are seeing growth really returning on all sectors downtown. But our transit system is bus. And Regional Transit Service, RTS, is our transit agency, and they have a transit center in the core of downtown, and that is the center point for all their operations. There are no bus lines on the new Union Street, although a number of bus lines do cross and benefit from the improvements that have been made. RTS are going through their own system redesign effort right now that they expect to launch this summer, which is going to result in more frequent service and faster service that's really focused on the city where the primary ridership is, and we're working with them. We're excited about that.
Great, thanks. And I will mention that to our panelists that the questions are still coming in fast and furious, so we've got about 10 more minutes for you all. But I will, it's great. Lots of interest in the details of what's happening in Rochester, so I appreciate that from everybody. So I'll toss a question over to Ben. Have you been successful in convincing state DOTs who are set on expanding existing interstate highways to change course and remove them? If so, how do you do that?
Well, I think in terms of highway expansions and state DOTs, there's some really good campaigns out there right now. I point people who are interested in following along to what's going on in Portland, Oregon around the I-5 expansion in the Rose Quarter. And there's a group, have a great website, great web presence, great social media presence, the No More Freeways Expansion PDX group. And they've come up with a template for how to mobilize, and sort of and capture all of the opinions of folks living in this this neighborhood on what their vision is towards the expansion of the highway and sort of the seizures that come with it and the expanded car presence. And so they really work closely, or they really work on that. And I think one of the successes that they've had and that other groups have had as well is finding a champion in either at the municipal level, at the state level, or perhaps even at the federal level, of a politician who is willing to support this cause. And so, for instance, this is actually throwing this back to New York State. New York State DOT, this isn't, say, an expansion in itself, but has looked at reconsidering what to do with the Buffalo Skyway. And in that case, Representative Brian Higgins has been a longtime supporter of the movement to convert the Skyway from a highway into something else. Governor Cuomo has hosted a design competition around transforming the Skyway corridor. So finding that champion and is really key, I think, towards a lot of towards stopping some of the highway expansions that are occurring in cities today.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Here's a question back for our Rochester folks. Do you think this proposal would have been unsuccessful if the loop had higher traffic use? What advice would you give to communities who are interested in highway removal but still have heavy use of the highway?
Well, I will say, obviously, having the traffic volumes that it did help smooth that process. Also, the fact that it took so long for us to get through this point. Again, it first appeared in a planning document in 1990, which was pretty visionary, right? To be calling for a highway removal back then, and it's because of its continual appearance in every official planning document, even community planning documents. There was a sense that this was going to happen, and it was generally welcome. As we look at Interloop North, which goes from 10,000 cars a day at the low end up to 45,000+ cars a day at its western end, those volumes are still reasonable for being hosted within the existing street grid. The question is just how. Right now, it gets all concentrated into one location, and so when you reimagine that, we have to be deliberate about where in the network does that go. And making sure that we account for that. And when you have more traffic volumes, you have more and more varied constituencies that are involved, and there's going to be more competing interests involved. So yes, I would say that the low traffic volumes in this corridor made it easier, and frankly, we didn't have much vocal and organized opposition to the project either. I would say that the number one question to me is a limited access expressway in an urban core the highest and best use of land that benefits that urban core? Who is it for? Who is it serving? And if the answer is not, residents and businesses of your community, is that really what's the best thing? And you go to the community and you said, what can this be? And in the case of Interloop North, we know that we can reconnect neighborhoods that have been long severed. We can create new land that's not just for different types of development purposes, but open spaces where there just aren't any. It's a very park board. It's a different sort of environment on the north side than it is on that southeast side. And so, is it right that neighborhood, that community has this 10 to 12 lane freeway facility, regardless of what its traffic volume is carrying. Is this the right place for this facility? Is it necessary? And what could it be?
I'll add a little bit to what Eric said, in that, well, the inner loop counts are certainly low. The counts for the San Francisco removals were around, I think, 70,000 ADT, so of a higher magnitude. And still, there was not the sort of Carmageddon that was often predicted in public newspapers.
Okay, thanks, Ben. A couple more here. So what are the top lessons learned from the Inner Loop East as the city moves forward in considering Inner Loop North?
Well, I guess the number one lesson learned, I hope, that's taken away by those who are involved in the process as we consider Inner Loop North. Hopefully the number one takeaway is that it can be done. It can be done almost seamlessly, efficiently, and successfully. Any thoughts that this was not going to work, either from a traffic standpoint, a traffic operations standpoint, a development standpoint, have been proven wrong, right? And so as we look to Inner Loop North, we can demonstrate that we can indeed do this kind of work, and it in fact is a great lift to the community. And I think that's demonstrated by the fact that regional economic development officials consider Inner Loop North to be a potential economic development priority for the region as a whole. Lessons learned also are to be deliberate in the planning process, right? Say we intend to move ahead with something, right? So we're not open-ended with this, but we're saying, we have a goal of achieving this. How do we get to that goal? And I think lessons learned as far as, what works and what doesn't work when you replace a highway. One thing we learned, and it's a minor detail, but the pavement treatment that we used on the bike facility is a porous treatment, but it's not necessarily the best for the bikes that are using it. And so we would probably not use that treatment on a future track type of facility. So that the number one thing is that we can do this, and that we can do more of it.
On the development side, I would add, just based on some of the public comments and some of the realities we faced after RFP proposals came in, is to plan for open space and parking going in, if that's a real need. Because at the time we were hearing about this, the city, had undergone a $21 million project, and there wasn't going to be much more public spending done for those kinds of things. And so in the RFP, we tried to ask for publicly funded, privately funded, but publicly accessible open space. Well, in a distressed market, that's a bit of a tall order. And basically, we're not getting any of that from any of our developers. The other thing on the development side is, we were asking for restaurants and a lot more commercial use on the ground floor to create this activity and this buzz. But the reality was that we had a high commercial vacancy on adjacent and adjoining streets and neighborhoods. So were you really going to exacerbate that vacancy by creating restaurants and retail here? Whatever the case is, that didn't really materialize for us to the extent that we wanted it to. And so you may not get what you want, but just be flexible enough to pivot and take these lessons along to the next project.
Okay. Kind of one last follow-up on that. The traditional development pattern is fine-grained and very resilient. On phase 2, will you break that up into new land, or break up that new land into smaller parcels instead of developing block-sized buildings?
Well, that remains to be seen. We have to go through the process and identify what the preferred alternative or alternatives will be. There's going to be potentially a lot more land created through Inner Loop North, and so that provides opportunities for different things that maybe we didn't have or wasn't properly suited for in Interloop East. So I can recall some conversations about having smaller scale development parcels, and that maybe was not the right fit for Interloop East, but could be in some locations as part of Interloop North. So I can't say yes or no, other than that we'll clearly look into it, and that will be something to consider. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that.
Great. So now that we've kind of reached our limit, any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the group?
I'll just say on behalf of Rochester that, thank you for the opportunity to speak to all of you and your interest in our project. We're really proud of what we've done. Like I said, I hope that it's both inspiring to peer cities. We've hosted a number of cities here, and I hope that we're helping to advance the agenda going forward, and to everybody involved, keep Rochester on the list. There's more Interloop to remove, and we're in that process.
And also, you have our email addresses at the ends of the PowerPoint, so you're definitely welcome to get in touch if you have specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you too to Ben, who was also on our previous webinar on the City of Milwaukee's experience, which you can see on our webinar archives. So with that, we're going to conclude our webinar today. American highways are being removed. What's next? I'd like to offer a big thank you to Eric, Ann, and Ben for a great presentation, and to all those who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org next week. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and our e-newsletter for details on other future webinars, including one on February 28th called Strategies for Coastal Resilience, How Communities Need to Adapt in Coordination with Island Press, and on March 27th, Proact Now, Planning Effectively in a Rapidly Changing World with David Rouse and Ben Hitchings. Looking forward to both of those. Have a great day.